We got a great guest here, Elbridge Colby. He's a principal at the Marathon Initiative, and he's the author of a new book, The Strategy of Denial. We've had him on the show before. Bridge, we have very fortuitous timing here. We have a Taiwan expert booked. He was going to talk about NATO, but it turns out at the very same time, our president is abroad in Japan making some major comments about the defense of Taiwan when asked if we would defend them militarily. Here's what he had to say.
We didn't want to get involved in the Ukraine conflict militarily for obvious reasons. Are you willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan if it comes to that?
Yes.
You are?
That's the commitment we made. That's the commitment we made.
Well, Bridge, let's just get your immediate reaction to that. I mean, so full disclosure, you've written the book, you're an advocate of defense of Taiwan. We had you on for our debate segment, but just purely from an analytical point of view, what do you make of the president in his departure from strategic ambiguity here?
Well, I think he's wise, but I actually think I think he's right, but I think it's actually unwise in the sense that I actually think he's correct that we should and almost invariably would come to Taiwan's defense. The question is more whether we would be effective. But the thing is not to, the way I think about it is like we're kind of poking the dragon right now. I think we should maintain the sort of formal policy, almost like the fiction of strategic ambiguity, which is a kind of decades-old policy that allows us to kind of interact with the Chinese. But we should very clearly understand that we would come to Taiwan's defense. But the key there is actually to resource it and have the prioritization, the focus. And you mentioned Europe. We're not doing that right now. We're sending $40 billion to Europe, basically. And there's almost nothing to show for it in the Asia Pacific. And the situation is grave and it's deteriorating.
Let's just back up for a second for people who aren't, super enmeshed in Taiwan and the politics around this. Can you just explain to people what the policy has been, what is strategic ambiguity, and why this is such a dramatic shift in terms of U.S. policy?
Sure. I mean, so very briefly, there was a civil war in China. It was resolved in 1949. The communists won. The nationalist government that was U.S. aligned escaped to Taiwan. For a variety of reasons, we basically protected them, and there was an alliance. We actually recognized the government on Taiwan as the government of China. As part of the opening to China in the 1970s, we shifted recognition to Beijing, and we basically it's a contentious issue, but we basically acknowledged that there was one China and that we would not kind of push for Taiwan independence and so forth. One of the fudges was what is called strategic ambiguity, which is a formal policy where we don't make it clear officially whether we would come to Taiwan's defense. That said, there are things like the Taiwan Relations Act that Congress passed that say we would regard as a very serious issue. So there's the formal policy. What's changed is China's ability to do something. Mao wanted to take over Taiwan, but he couldn't. Xi Jinping wants to take over Taiwan, and he plausibly can.
Yes.
And so that's the big difference. And so we have been neglecting the focus. This is one of the reasons I wrote this book. But what this is about our kind of formal government policy. This is not the most important issue actually around this. It's the one that gets the most attention, but it's not the most important issue.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that originally, and let's pivot to that then, as you point to, like, okay, reviews on Taiwan aside, as you're pointing to, the current U.S. policy under the Biden administration is a major prioritization of Europe. Now, we have spent, I actually was informed very much by your analysis. I did a whole monologue here, how we have sent 50-some billion over to Europe, when the Europeans themselves have sent a total of like maybe 10, if you're using generous accounting. I mean, what does it mean, Bridge, in this age of where we're sending our excess javelin capacity, so much of our military aid, so much of our political complete obsession in terms of foreign policy is in Europe in an area which, to my view, and I think yours as well, lacks the strategic, whatever you think about Taiwan, it seems far more strategically important to the future of the United States than of whatever happens in Ukraine.
Well, I think you're right. And I mean, look, this is not about Taiwan. I mean, frankly, I'm not thinking about Taiwan's interests. I'm thinking about Americans' interests. But when we think about that, by far the most important theater of the world is Asia. It's going to be well over 50% of global GDP. And by far the most significant threat out there is China. China is 10x the Russian GDP. And Taiwan is really close. It's central to the security situation in Asia, and I can go into that. But there's no buffer. There's no Ukraine. Taiwan is more like Poland, basically. And it's very difficult to defend. And so what I want to do is I want to deter a war. I want to prevent a war by deterring it. The thing that's happening is the Pentagon and some other places are saying some good things about China and Taiwan. But they're often saying, we're going to get to it in 2035. But the revealed behavior is a prioritization of Europe. And my point of view is like, look, I think a war is very plausible. China has the will to take over Taiwan. It increasingly has a way, and it may have a sense of urgency about it. So yes, I hear some good things from the Pentagon stuff, but if like we really thought a war with a superpower was on the verge of happening, wouldn't you think that things would be different?
Yeah.
Would you be sending $40 billion and having, let's be honest, members of both parties getting up and say, oh, it's one theater? Wrong. There are real choices, and now is the time to make them, and that's not happening. And I think frankly, I think we're at the point where people need to be aware of the accountability, where you could have a 9/11 commission or a Pearl Harbor investigation, and who's going to be responsible. And I think that's not just the sort of hippie lefties or whatever, because nobody expects them to do it. It's people who should know better, who should be prioritizing the primary threat, and that's not happening.
Yeah.
So I think what the administration would say in response, if I can play devil's advocate here, is look, the very fact that we made this trip, that Biden, the administration is actually walking back Biden's comments on all of this and saying, no, he didn't mean that at all, even though it was very clear, very clear what he said. But they say, look, we announced this economic bloc, which I'm also curious what your view is there. So this shows you we can walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. Yes, we have to focus on what's going on in Ukraine with Russia, but we also are very much focused on Asia Pacific and developments there, making sure that we're securing the supply chain and securing the sort of economic bloc so that China doesn't dominate the region. What would your response to that be?
Well, you may know that the comment "walk and chew gum" triggers me because if you were thinking that you were going to get into a superpower war, would you call it walking or chewing gum?
Yeah.
You'd call it like, I'm about to get into a marathon and I need to compete at the level of the Kenyans in the Olympics.
Yes.
Or I'm going to bite off, I don't know, pick your thing, I'm going to wrestle a bear and eat him. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about. So when people say, oh, we're going to walk and chew gum, that actually tells me that people have no serious understanding of what's involved. And the administration, yes, they say these things, but I mean, first of all, the Chinese are building a real military for it. So, and that is not about going and having pretty meetings. The administration talks up the Quad, it talks up its economic framework, and I have some sympathy for it and so forth. But that ain't the same as real military investments. Like, you're about to have Pearl Harbor. Are you ready? I mean, we actually were probably more ready before Pearl Harbor than what we're doing now. And so that's what I would say is it's a hard power thing, and resources are scarce, and not just military resources, political resources. What's he talking about with the president of South Korea and the prime minister?
Let's actually talk about that, the political resources, because you made a comment at the beginning that you think that U.S. coming to the military defense of Taiwan is inevitable. I would suggest that the political will is not in place to do that currently, although, we'd need to see polling and see what happens if these eventualities unfold. How are you reading that? Why do you believe that there would be the political will and that this would ultimately be inevitable?
I think it's a combination of the almost certain both domestic and international political pressure. So just on polling, and you guys would know better than I, my understanding of the polling on Taiwan is there's much stronger, actually support for defending Taiwan has increased significantly in the last few years. There's a Chicago Council poll. The Reagan Institute also did a poll that suggests that. Now, American views on these things are fairly plastic. On the other hand, the President of the United States, who's a very left Democrat, has basically said...
Would dispute that, but...
Well, I mean, from my point of view. Has basically said several times that he's prepared to defend, and the political opposition from the Republican Party is that we should do more and be prepared to do so. So I think if Biden fails to do it, he will have committed himself. The United States is already committed, and he will be humiliated. The United States will lose its first great power war in its history. Okay? Secondly, the international pressure, because of the importance of Taiwan to what I call the anti-hegemonic coalition in Asia, will be so controlling that if we don't act, you could act. I was talking to a senior diplomat from an Asia-Pacific country who was like, if we lose Taiwan, and this is not an extreme person or country, it's like if Taiwan falls, people will all cut deals. So I think that's the issue. The question, Krystal, the key is to drive down the costs. So I'm not theological about Taiwan. We may get to the point where we can't defend Taiwan, and then we will have to abandon it, but that will be disaster for us and for the region, although I'm thinking more about us.
And what do you make of the Zeihan analysis? We had him on the show last week that basically says because of demographics, China is set to have massive demographic bust, which I think if you look at the numbers is pretty indisputable, especially since they had the one-child policy for so many years. So while you have many countries around the world that are facing this demographic bust in terms of their, workforce-aged population, China is an extreme example facing this down at the fastest rate in history, that's going to cause them all sorts of problems. And so the idea that they're this juggernaut that we must go to war with to protect our own interest is sort of far-fetched. I'm summarizing here. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but that was the gist of what I took from his analysis.
Well, a couple things. I mean, one, I would say I'm not an economist, but I'll confess that I'm skeptical of that kind of view. And secondly, even if he's right, we should prepare for the downside risk because we don't know what the future is. So, I mean, where's my skepticism? Well, yes, but demographic trends are happening all around the world. They're happening in the other Northeast Asian states. They're happening among the native born population here and in Europe and so forth. And even if, let's say the Chinese conk out where the Japanese left off, they'll still be an economy of roughly twice the size that we are. Look, I mean, financial industries, Elon Musk is still putting enormous investments into China. China's the largest trading partner, I believe, of most of the countries in the world. So I guess he could be right, but I frankly am skeptical. Secondly, though, what if he's wrong? So if he's right and we overprepare and do what I did, no big deal. Okay, we wasted some money and that would be bad. But I mean, the alternative is if I'm right and he's wrong and we didn't prepare, we will lose and we'll all live under the Chinese thumb.
I want to get to one of the things the trade-offs the administration is talking about right now, Bridge, which is that the U.S. is considering lifting tariffs to fight inflation. Now, I find this very interesting because one of the reasons that we have high inflation is because we have zero economic resiliency and we've relied on China and they make all of our stuff. But two, it is fine to say we have a Putin price hike and then lift tariffs on Beijing. And if you consider, what the long-term prospects of that economically are, especially from a strategic point of view and our own economic resiliency, this is why we're in the situation where we are right now. So I'm just curious for your view in terms of a total strategic kind of orientation the United States has under the Biden administration. What does that leave us vulnerable to in the future if there is chaos in Asia? Like you said, look, maybe we don't come to Taiwan's defense. If that's true, you're going to have a nuclear Japan, you're going to have a nuclear South Korea, you're going to have the entire region in chaos, and it might actually have a war in the first place. Regardless, it's going to have a massive impact on us. If you think Putin's price hike is bad, just wait until Xi's price hike for something like that. What do we have in the gas tank, rhetorically speaking, to even deal with that currently, with the current administration's orientation?
Well, I think it's kind of nuts and not insane to be taking off the tariffs at this point when they haven't really satisfied. And we should be building up our industries at home anyway and increasing our resilience, as you suggest. And why are we giving the Chinese credit instead of building up our energy independence and so forth? Right. I mean, doing the other things that would make sense on inflation. So I think look, we're all sympathetic to what people are going through, but that's not the way to do it. And we're going to have a worse outcome if we increase our dependence on China going forward. One thing I will say is that what this shows you is that strategies for dealing with China in Asia that don't rely on military denial are not credible, because already the president is doing things like, so when somebody says, oh, we'll sanction the Chinese into oblivion or whatever, forget it, right? Mm-hmm. They're already talking about giving up the leverage because Yellen and all these people are banging the table. So Larry Fink is calling on the phone or something, right? So let's be real. If we don't have a military denial, and I would just say, Saagar, it's not so much, nuclear Japan would not be the worst outcome.
No, I actually kind of support it.
The worst, I think I talk about it in the book, but I think that the worst outcome is well over 50% of global GDP that's under China's control, that probably uses the yuan, that follows Chinese regulations, that is the gatekeeper for all American companies, indirect or directly, and we're all going to be working for that, right? Yeah. That's the world that we're going to live in.
What do you make of the economic bloc that was supposed to be the main news item coming out of this press conference before Biden did his thing? How significant is this? How similar is it to TPP? What's the impact ultimately?
I mean, I don't have a super strong. I mean, I'm sympathetic in the sense the middle class, the trade policy for the middle class. I'm very sympathetic, as I think you guys are, to that idea. And it's a tough. I mean, look, the real culprits in this are the people who gave globalization a bad name by over-financialization and not insisting that China and others follow the rules and so forth. So it's not the fault of the people who are now skeptical about trade. I think the IPEF, as I think it's called, it's not really landing very well in Asia. Yes. I mean, just because they want trade, they want open markets. Of course they do. They want to make more money.
But
we're
TPP.
Also skeptical. But Americans don't want a TPP. Yeah. So, I mean, when a blob dweller like me says something like TPP is important, that's worse than meaningless. It's like counterproductive. What I will say is that I believe in a worker-friendly and middle-class-friendly trade policy. But also, we're going to be dealing with 1.4 or maybe 1.2 billion Chinese who have no data protections, who have no privacy protections. We need to have the scale for our companies to be able to compete. Mm-hmm. So I do think a quote-unquote free world sort of economic area is going to need to be where we move. The question is how to do that. I don't know what the answer is, but I think that's a real area where creative political leadership is going to be necessary.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you have to be able to preserve both. And unfortunately, we have never seen any prioritization of the first one. And, there's no current guarantee, I would say, currently that the current administration prioritizes that when you have the top leaders and the top Treasury Secretary and more saying, oh yeah, we should take off these tariffs on China. So the last thing I want to get to you is the urgency point of view that you said. You said that there could be some urgency on the Chinese part. What domestic political condition did they face where it would be urgent in order to do this?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'll tell you the one that I'm most worried about, which is that the defense, the military balance in the Pacific, our defense people are talking more about the 2030s. That's when a lot of our military investments replacing the Reagan-era investments will come online. It's also this quad, this coalition is kind of coming together. You can see it. Taiwan, South Korea is kind of becoming more aligned. So if you're China, you say, I've got an opportunity potentially right now, certainly in the coming years by 2027, why not act? If you look at why major wars have happened in the past, they've often happened because of this window of vulnerability. I don't put as much purchase into this one, but another thing that people do mention is the thing that Peter Zeihan was talking about. Well, if they know they're going off a demographic cliff and an economic cliff, well, let me get out ahead and build an economic zone that I control to avoid that outcome. So that actually makes it worse. Again, that I don't put as much stock in that. There's also the fact that Xi Jinping is specifically tethered his own leadership and what he calls the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, it's this big thing, to the resolution of the Taiwan issue.
Yes.
Again, I don't know if that's enough, but that's another factor. So again, I look at will weigh urgency and I get real worried.
The argument I've heard against the urgent case that you're making is that the sort of unified and larger than expected response to Ukraine may serve as some deterrent. What do you make of that argument?
I think it's kind of a wash. It's possible that I certainly think that the Chinese are taking a cautionary note. Part of it's that response. Part of it's the difficulties the Russians have had. But I will say a couple things. First of all, it's almost all in Europe.
Yep.
So it's European countries because it's a European issue. It's not crazy. It's not an alliance of democracies. It's basically mostly European countries. So and those countries will be less likely to take a similar line over Taiwan for a variety of reasons, partially because they've taken such a hit. It actually trades against their ability to do something against China. I was in a meeting with a senior German official a couple months ago who was like, hey, how can we get China to help us with Russia? Because they're taking a huge hit on the oil and gas extrication. So what? They're going to completely, strangle their own economy by doing that to China? China's 10x the Russian economy. And we can already see with the administration considering giving up these tariffs, the reality of what this is going to be. So I don't think, and in fact, Bill Burns, the CIA director, said he doesn't think that Xi Jinping's given up on the Taiwan issue at all. And Avril Haines, the DNI, said it's an acute threat. And I'm thinking, I guess the last point, if we have an acute threat of a major war that we're going to get into, shouldn't we be acting like it? Where is that?
Right.
Is it your sense at all that Xi is politically vulnerable?
Possibly. I mean, I think it's possible. Again, I wouldn't bet on it. And I think here's the thing. I call it the Madeleine Albright effect. I mean, Madeleine Albright famously or infamously said to Colin Powell on the Balkans issue, because Powell was Powell Doctrine Restraint, post-Vietnam, and she said, why do we have this amazing military if we can't use it? So Chinese leaders are much stronger. So Chinese people are going to expect action. I mean, we would never have done the Iraq War in 1976 because we were like, God, I don't want to get in that kind of thing again, right? But then in 2003, we did this epically stupid thing, So the Chinese are going to have a similar dynamic where they're just a lot stronger and they expect to be treated accordingly. Maybe Xi is a stronger variant, but I don't think it would be radically different than his plausible successors.
I think that's a great point. Bridge, I've learned a lot from this conversation. We really appreciate it. We're very fortuitous in having you on the show, so we really appreciate it.
Always
Thanks
a pleasure.
Very much.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you for all our premium subscribers supporting the show. Reminder about the scheduling, we're going to be Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and we will see you all on Wednesday.
See you guys on Wednesday. Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.